The cargo bay of the mining station echoed with a sound that made everyone's scales crawl. It wasn't the usual hum of machinery or the clank of metal on metal that filled the asteroid facility. This was different. This was organic. Desperate. Zara pressed her clawed hands against her audio receptors, trying to block out the pitiful wailing that had been going on for 3 standard cycles now. The other Catherian workers shuffled past the sealed containment unit, their serpentine necks bent low in discomfort. None of them could bear to look at what was inside. "Someone needs to do something about that creature," hissed Velkane, the shift supervisor. His yellow eyes flicked toward the transparent aluminum container that held their unwelcome cargo. "The noise is affecting productivity." Inside the unit, barely visible through the scratched surface, a small form huddled in the corner. The creature was no bigger than a Catherian juvenile, but its appearance was utterly alien, pale pink skin instead of scales, strange tufts of brown fiber sprouting from its skull, and most disturbing of all, water continuously leaked from its optical organs. The thing had been discovered 3 days ago in the wreckage of an unknown vessel that had crashed into asteroid mining complex 7. The ship's design was unlike anything in the galactic databases. Its hull was made from primitive metals, held together with crude welding techniques that any first-year engineering student would have been ashamed to produce. Yet somehow this ramshackle craft had made it through the void of space. When the salvage team had cut through the wreckage, they'd found dozens of strange pods filled with a thick yellow fluid. Most were empty and broken, their contents long since leaked away. But one pod still functioned, its primitive life support system somehow keeping the small creature inside alive. The being appeared to be some sort of larval form, though no one could determine what species it might belong to. Dr. Ixthala, the station's xenobiologist, had run every scan she could think of. The results made no sense. The creature's cellular structure was completely unknown, its genetic markers matching nothing in the galactic registry of sentient species. "Perhaps it's some kind of biological weapon," suggested Nextor from his position at the scanning console. "The ship could have been carrying experimental organisms." Dr. Ixthala's neck frills flared in disagreement. "The scans show no signs of hostile pathogens or genetic modifications. This appears to be a naturally occurring life form. Just one we've never encountered before," the crying continued, a sound that seemed to bypass all rational thought and strike directly at something primitive in the listener's brain. Even the normally composed Catherians found themselves unsettled by it. There was something in that sound, something that spoke of pain and abandonment and desperate need. "We should contact the Galactic Council," said Velkane, his tail lashing with agitation. "Let them deal with this, whatever it is." But Dr. Ixthala was studying the readouts from the creature's containment unit with growing concern. The atmospheric composition in its pod was different from standard ship environment. Higher oxygen content, specific humidity levels, and traces of gases we don't normally encounter. "I believe this atmosphere is necessary for its survival. Then we maintain the environment and wait for pickup," Velkane decided. "The council can determine what to do with it." The nearest council facility was 12 standard cycles away, even using the fastest courier ship. The creature would have to remain in containment until then, continuing its endless, heartbreaking wails. "Marcus." Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his battered maintenance shuttle toward the docking bay of Mining Complex 7. The human had been working the outer rim trade routes for 5 years now, fixing broken equipment and patching hull breaches for whoever could pay his modest fees. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him moving through the galaxy, which was all he really wanted. The Catherian station manager who had hired him seemed agitated during their communication, more so than usual for the typically calm reptilian species. Something about malfunctioning atmospheric processors and urgent repairs needed. Marcus didn't ask too many questions. Credits were credits, and his ship needed fuel and supplies. As his shuttle settled into the docking bay, Marcus noticed something odd. The usual bustle of activity around the cargo area seemed subdued. Workers moved quickly past a large section of the bay, their heads down and their pace hurried. Even through the thick hull of his ship, he could hear something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It sounded like crying. But not just any crying. It sounded like a child. Marcus had heard that sound before years ago in the ruins of a bombed-out settlement on Kepler 442b. The sound of someone small and helpless and utterly alone. The memory made his hands shake slightly as he powered down his shuttle's engines. "Focus on the job," he muttered to himself. "Get in, fix the processors, get paid, get out." But as he gathered his tools and prepared to disembark, that crying continued to echo through the station's hull. And despite his best efforts to ignore it, Marcus Chen found himself wondering what could possibly make such a sound in the cold depths of space. The human mechanic had no idea that his arrival would change everything for a small, frightened creature that had been calling out for help in a language no one else could understand. He didn't know that sometimes the universe has a way of bringing the right person to the right place at exactly the right time. All Marcus knew was that he had work to do. But first he was going to find out what was making that sound. Marcus followed the sound through the winding corridors of the mining station, his tool bag slung over his shoulder, and his boots echoing against the metal floor. The Catherian workers he passed seemed nervous, their scales rippling with agitation. Several tried to steer him away from the cargo bay, but Marcus had spent enough time around different alien species to read body language. Even when it came from beings who looked like walking lizards, they were afraid of something, and that something was making the crying sound that had been gnawing at his gut since he'd docked. "Human Chen," called a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see a tall Catherian in supervisor markings approaching. "I am Velcane. We spoke about the atmospheric processor repairs." "Right," Marcus said, not stopping his walk toward the cargo bay. "Is that what's making all the noise? Busted atmospheric system can cause some weird sounds." Velcane's neck frills twitched nervously. "The repairs are needed in Section C7. This area is restricted." Marcus paused at the entrance to the cargo bay. The crying was louder here, and it definitely wasn't coming from any machine. "Sounds like someone's in trouble." "It is merely a recovered specimen," Velcane said quickly. "Nothing that concerns your repair work." But Marcus was already looking past the supervisor, and what he saw made his blood run cold. In the center of the cargo bay sat a containment unit, and inside it was a small figure hunched in the corner. Even through the distorted transparency of the container, Marcus could make out the unmistakable silhouette of a human child. "What the hell?" Marcus dropped his tool bag and strode toward the container, ignoring Velcane's protests. As he got closer, his suspicions were confirmed. The creature inside was definitely human, probably no more than 4 or 5 years old. The child's clothes were strange, made from materials Marcus didn't recognize, but the face was unmistakably human. Tear-streaked, terrified, and desperately alone. "Open this thing," Marcus demanded, spinning around to face Velcane. "That is not possible," the Catherian replied, his tail lashing with agitation. "The creature requires a specific atmospheric composition to survive. The containment unit maintains the proper environment." Marcus looked at the readout on the side of the container. The atmospheric mix was indeed different from the station's standard environment, but not by much. Higher oxygen content, slightly different humidity, trace gases that looked familiar but that he couldn't quite place. "How long has he been in there?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. 3 standard cycles. "We discovered it in the wreckage of an unknown vessel. 3 days. The kid had been trapped in that box for 3 days, crying for help that never came." Marcus felt something hot and sharp twist in his chest. He'd seen enough human colonies destroyed by wars and disasters to know what abandonment looked like. And this child was drowning in it. "He's human," Marcus said flatly. Dr. Ixthala, who had been observing from a safe distance, slithered forward. "Impossible. There are no human settlements in this sector. Besides, our genetic scans show no match to any known species in the galactic database." Marcus almost laughed. "Your database doesn't include humans because we're not part of your galactic community yet. We've barely made it out of our own solar system, and what few ships we have are exactly like the wreckage you found. Primitive, jury-rigged, and held together with hope and stubbornness." The revelation sent ripples of unease through the assembled Catherians. A previously unknown spacefaring species was significant news, especially one that looked so similar to the various bipedal races already known to the galaxy. "If this is true," Dr. Ixthala said slowly, "then this changes the legal status of the creature. Sentient beings cannot be held in containment without proper cause. His name is probably not Creature," Marcus said dryly. "And right now I don't care about legal status. I care about getting him out of that box." Marcus knelt down beside the containment unit and tapped gently on the transparent surface. The child looked up, his tear-filled eyes widening as he saw Marcus's face. For the first time in 3 days, the crying stopped. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus said softly, using the universal tone that humans instinctively adopted when talking to frightened children. "I know you're scared, but it's going to be okay. I'm going to get you out of there." The child pressed his small hands against the inside of the container, directly opposite where Marcus had placed his own palm. Through the barrier, human looked at human, and something passed between them that transcended species and language and the vast emptiness of space. "The atmospheric requirements," Dr. Ixthala protested. "If we open the containment unit, the creature could suffocate." Marcus was already studying the environmental controls, his engineer's mind cataloging the differences between the child's atmosphere and the station's standard mix. "It's not that different. Higher oxygen will just make him more alert, and the trace gases—" "Wait." He leaned closer to the readout, recognizing something he'd seen before in his own ship's atmospheric system. "These aren't alien gases. This is the atmosphere from a human ship. Recycled air always picks up trace elements from the life support systems. Different ships have different signatures based on their scrubber technology." Marcus straightened up, his decision made. "I'm opening it." "You cannot," Velcane said firmly. "Station regulations require—" "Station regulations can kiss my ass," Marcus interrupted, his patience finally snapping. "That's a scared kid in there, not a lab specimen. And since he's human, that makes him my responsibility." The human mechanic began working on the containment unit's locking mechanism, his tools moving with practiced efficiency. The Catherians watched in fascination and growing alarm as he bypassed safety protocols with casual expertise. "Even if you're correct about his species," Dr. Ixthala said, "you don't know what psychological damage may have occurred. The stress of captivity, the trauma of whatever happened to his ship." Marcus paused in his work and looked back at the child, who was watching him with desperate hope. "Then it's a good thing humans are really stubborn about taking care of our own." The locks disengaged with a soft hiss, and the containment unit began to open. The moment the containment unit opened, the child launched himself into Marcus's arms with a desperation that nearly knocked the mechanic over. Small hands clutched at Marcus's work shirt, and the boy's face buried against his shoulder as fresh sobs shook his tiny frame. But these tears were different from the hopeless wailing that had echoed through the station for 3 days. These were tears of relief. Marcus found his arms closing around the child automatically, muscle memory from a life he'd left behind on Earth taking over. The boy was lighter than he should have been, probably dehydrated and malnourished from his ordeal. His strange clothes were made from some kind of synthetic material that felt like a cross between silk and plastic, but they were clean and well made. Someone had cared for this child before disaster struck. "It's okay," Marcus murmured, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "You're safe now. I've got you." The Catherians watched in fascination as the human child's distress visibly decreased in Marcus's presence. Dr. Ixthala was taking readings with a handheld scanner, her neck frills quivering with excitement. "Remarkable," she whispered. "The child's stress hormones are dropping rapidly. Heart rate is stabilizing. There appears to be some kind of instinctive recognition between your species." Marcus wasn't listening to the scientific commentary. He was focused on the warm weight in his arms and the way the boy's breathing was starting to even out. After a few minutes, the child pulled back slightly to look at Marcus's face, his eyes red-rimmed but no longer filled with the wild panic that had consumed him for days. "Can you understand me?" Marcus asked gently. The boy said something in a language that sounded almost familiar but not quite right. The words had a musical quality that reminded Marcus of old Earth languages he'd heard in historical recordings, but he couldn't make out the meaning. Different dialect, Marcus mused. Or maybe the colony ship developed its own linguistic drift over time. Dr. Ixthala slithered closer, her scanner beeping softly. "Colony ship?" Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the child's face. "Humans launched several generation ships before we developed faster-than-light travel. Most of them were aimed at distant star systems, carrying tens of thousands of people in cryogenic storage. This little guy's probably from one of those ships." The implications of that statement settled over the assembled Catherians like a cold wind. Generation ships meant large populations of humans scattered across the galaxy, completely unknown to the established galactic community. It was a significant diplomatic and scientific discovery, But Marcus wasn't thinking about diplomacy. He was thinking about the fact that if this child was from a generation ship, then the wreckage in the asteroid field represented thousands of human lives lost in the darkness of space. The other pods, Marcus said quietly. In the wreckage. How many were there? Velcane consulted his datapad. 47 cryogenic storage units were recovered. Only one was still functional. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that loss. An entire generation ship, carrying thousands of people toward a new home, reduced to wreckage and empty pods. This child might be the only survivor of his entire civilization. We need to go back to the wreck site, Marcus said. There might be data storage devices, ship logs, something that can tell us where they came from and where they were going. The wreckage has already been processed by our salvage teams, Velcane replied. Any valuable materials have been extracted and cataloged. I'm not talking about materials, Marcus said sharply. I'm talking about information, history, the story of these people's journey. The child in his arms had been listening to the conversation with obvious confusion. He said something else in his musical language, pointing toward the area where his containment unit had been. I think he's asking about the others, Marcus said, his heart breaking for the boy. He doesn't understand that he's alone. Dr. Ixthala's scanner was still beeping, recording biological data that would be invaluable to xenobiologists across the galaxy. But she found herself more interested in the emotional dynamics playing out before her. The way the human child instinctively trusted Marcus, the protective response that had awakened in the adult human, the obvious genetic and cultural connections between them. Despite what must have been centuries of separation, your species forms strong protective bonds, she observed. Strongest in the galaxy, Marcus said with quiet pride. We don't abandon our own, ever. Marcus stood up, lifting the child with him. The boy wrapped his legs around Marcus's waist and his arms around his neck, clinging like a small monkey. It was a position that any human would recognize immediately, the universal posture of a child seeking comfort from an adult. Where are you taking him? Velcane asked. My ship, Marcus replied. He needs food, water, and a proper medical check. Plus, I want to run some atmospheric tests to make sure I've got the life support calibrated correctly for human physiology. The station medical facility is more than adequate. The station medical facility is designed for Catherians, Marcus interrupted. This kid needs human care, and I'm the only human for light years in any direction. Dr. Ixthala made a decision that would later be recorded in her official report as either the beginning of formal human galactic relations or the worst breach of protocol in Catherian scientific history. I'm coming with you, she announced. This represents a first contact situation of unprecedented importance. Someone needs to document the interaction between human subspecies separated by time and distance. Velcane's tail lashed with agitation. Absolutely not. Station protocol doesn't cover this situation, Dr. Ixthala said firmly. This is a unique scientific opportunity, and I'm not going to let bureaucratic procedure interfere with potentially the most important xenobiological discovery of the century. Marcus was already walking toward the docking bay, the child still clinging to him like a lifeline. You can come if you want, Doc, but I'm not waiting for paperwork. This kid has been through enough. As they made their way through the station corridors, other Catherians stopped to stare at the strange procession. News of the human discovery was already spreading through the station's communication networks, and by the time Marcus reached his ship, half the facility knew that first contact had just occurred in their cargo bay. But for Marcus, the galaxy-shaking significance of the moment was secondary to the small, warm weight in his arms and the trust that had been placed in him by a child who had lost everything else in the universe. The human mechanic was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to protect that trust. Marcus's ship was everything the Catherian mining station was not. Where the station was sterile and coldly efficient, the human vessel felt lived in and comfortable. Mismatched panels showed where repairs had been made with whatever materials were available. Tools hung from magnetic strips alongside family photos and small personal items that spoke of a life spent wandering the galaxy. Dr. Ixthala found the ship's design fascinating from an anthropological perspective. The layout prioritized efficiency and personal comfort over aesthetic appeal, and every surface showed signs of modification and adaptation. It was clear that humans approached spaceflight As an extension of their living space, rather than simply a means of transportation, the child had relaxed enough to look around with curious eyes as Marcus carried him through the ship's narrow corridors. When they reached the small galley, the boy said something in his musical language and pointed at a coffee maker mounted to the bulkhead. He recognizes the equipment, Dr. Ixthala noted, suggesting similar technological development patterns between human populations. Marcus set the child down on a padded bench and knelt in front of him. "Are you hungry?" he asked, making eating motions with his hands. The boy nodded eagerly and said something that sounded almost like yes, but with different vowel sounds. Marcus rummaged through his food supplies, looking for something that would be safe for a child to eat. Most of his provisions were designed for adult humans working in space, but he found some preserved fruit and protein bars that looked promising. As the child ate with obvious relief, Marcus noticed details that had been hard to see in the poor lighting of the cargo bay. The boy's clothes were indeed made from advanced synthetic materials, but the cut and style were subtly different from contemporary human fashion. His hair was longer than was practical for shipboard life, suggesting that wherever he'd come from had different cultural norms. Most tellingly, there were small scars on his arms that looked like they came from medical procedures, possibly the kind of genetic modifications that generation ship populations sometimes required to adapt to their new environments. He's, been genetically modified, Marcus said quietly to Dr. Ixthala. Probably optimized for the environment of whatever planet his people were heading toward. Dr. Ixthala's scanner confirmed the observation. Enhanced bone density, improved cardiovascular efficiency, modifications to the digestive system to process different nutritional sources. Whoever sent out that generation ship was very thorough in their preparations. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for the people who had planned such a journey. Sending thousands of humans across the galaxy to establish a new colony required incredible courage and foresight. They had tried to give their children every possible advantage for survival in an unknown world, and now this child was the only one left. After the boy had eaten his fill, Marcus led him to the ship's small medical bay. The diagnostic equipment was designed for human physiology, and Marcus ran a complete scan to check for injuries or illness. The results were both reassuring and heartbreaking. "He's healthy," Marcus reported to Dr. Ixthala. "Dehydrated and underweight, but no serious medical issues. The cryogenic systems on his pod must have been working perfectly up until the accident." "Accident?" Dr. Ixthala questioned. Marcus called up the scan data on his main screen. "Look at the pattern of his nutritional deficiency. It's consistent with someone who was supposed to be in cryogenic sleep, but was awakened early due to system failure. He's probably been conscious and alone on that ship for weeks before the crash." The implications of that revelation hit both adults like a physical blow. The child hadn't just survived the destruction of his ship, he had been awake and aware during whatever catastrophe had killed everyone else aboard. He had watched his world die around him, powerless to stop it or understand what was happening. Dr. Ixthala's scientific detachment wavered for a moment. Even for a species as emotionally controlled as the Cytherians, the thought of a child experiencing such trauma was deeply disturbing. The boy had been watching their conversation with intelligent eyes, clearly understanding that they were talking about him even if he couldn't follow the words. When Marcus finished his explanation, the child said something in his musical language that sounded like a question. "I wish I could understand him," Marcus said softly. "I wish I could explain what happened and where he is now." Dr. Ixthala consulted her scanner, which had been recording and analyzing the child's speech patterns. The linguistic structure suggests a Romance language base with significant drift. Given enough time and data, our translation protocols might be able to establish basic communication. "We don't have enough time," Marcus said. "I need to get him somewhere safe and I need to figure out where he belongs." "Where he belongs?" Dr. Ixthala asked. Marcus looked at the child, who was examining the medical equipment with the fearless curiosity that seemed universal among human children. He was on a generation ship heading somewhere specific. His people had a destination, a plan, maybe even other ships in the fleet. I need to find out where they were going and whether anyone else made it. That could take years of investigation, Dr. Ixthala pointed out, cross-referencing stellar cartography, analyzing the ship's trajectory, checking for other human colonies or ship signatures. Then it takes years, Marcus said simply. What else am I going to do? Turn him over to some galactic foster care system? Let some bureaucracy decide his future? Dr. Ixthala found herself increasingly fascinated by human psychology. The protective response that Marcus displayed toward the child was so immediate and absolute that it bordered on the irrational. But there was something beautiful about it too. Something that spoke to evolutionary imperatives that transcended species. You're planning to adopt him, she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus hadn't consciously made that decision until she said it, but he realized it was true. The moment he had seen the child crying alone in that container, some deep part of his psyche had already made the commitment. He needs someone, Marcus said, and I'm what's available. The child, as if sensing the importance of the conversation, came over and leaned against Marcus's leg. He said something in his musical language that needed no translation. The tone was unmistakably affectionate, the gesture of a child who had decided to trust. Marcus placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. Besides, someone needs to teach him about the galaxy he's inherited. Might as well be someone who understands what it's like to be human in a universe full of aliens. Dr. Ixthala made a note in her scientific journal about the speed with which human social bonds could form, even across genetic and cultural barriers. Then she made another note about the legal complications that were about to arise when the Galactic Council learned about this situation. But as she watched the human mechanic kneel down to the child's level and begin showing him pictures on a datapad, trying to establish communication through shared images, she found herself hoping that bureaucracy would prove no match for human stubbornness. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you tried to separate a human from a child they had decided to protect. 3 days later, Marcus's ship was no longer alone in the asteroid field. A sleek Galactic Council vessel had arrived, its pristine hull reflecting the distant starlight as it maneuvered alongside the mining station. Commander Thex Vaughn, a high-ranking Altarian diplomatic officer, had come personally to investigate the first contact situation that was already sending ripples through the galactic political community. Marcus watched the council ship dock through his viewport while the child, who had taken to following him everywhere, played with a puzzle toy that Marcus had improvised from spare electronic components. The boy had adapted to life aboard the ship with remarkable resilience, and his natural curiosity had already led him to explore every corner of the small vessel. Troubles here, Marcus muttered, recognizing the distinctive design of a council diplomatic ship. Dr. Ixthala, who had spent the last 3 days documenting every aspect of human behavior and psychology, looked up from her notes. You knew this moment would come? The discovery of a new sentient species requires official investigation and classification. He's not a new species, Marcus said firmly. He's human. Just because the council didn't know we existed doesn't make us any less real. A communication request came through on Marcus's console. Commander Thex Vaughn's imperious face appeared on the screen, his blue-scaled features arranged in an expression of barely concealed annoyance. Human Chen, the Altarian said, without preamble. You will prepare the recovered specimen for transfer to our vessel immediately. The Galactic Council has jurisdiction over all first contact situations. His name is probably something like Danny or Michael or Jake, Marcus replied evenly, and he's not going anywhere. Commander Thex Vaughn's neck frills flared with indignation. You have no legal standing in this matter. The creature was recovered in council space by a council-affiliated facility. Proper protocols must be followed. Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to leave Earth in the first place. Bureaucrats who thought they could make decisions about people's lives from behind their comfortable desks, reducing human beings to statistics and procedures. Proper protocols, Marcus repeated. Like keeping a scared kid locked in a box for 3 days while you run your scans and fill out your paperwork? The specimen's safety required. His safety requires someone who gives a damn about him as a person, Marcus interrupted. Someone who understands that he's not a lab experiment or a diplomatic problem to be solved. The child, hearing the tension in Marcus's voice, came over and took his hand. The boy said something in his musical language that sounded like a question, his eyes moving between Marcus and the image on the screen. It's okay, buddy, Marcus said softly, switching to the gentle tone he used when talking to the child. Just some people who think they're more important than they are. Commander Thex Vaughn had been observing the interaction with interest. The creature has formed an attachment to you. That will make the transition more difficult, but our xenopsychologists are trained to deal with such situations. Transition to what? Dr. Ixthala asked, speaking for the first time since the communication had begun. The specimen will be taken to the Central Research Facility on Altair Prime for comprehensive study, Commander Thex Vaughn explained. Full genetic analysis, psychological evaluation, cultural assessment. The process typically takes several standard cycles. Several cycles? Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. You want to lock him up in some research facility for years? The discovery of a new sentient species is a matter of galactic importance, the commander replied. Proper scientific study is essential before any decisions can be made about integration or classification. Marcus looked down at the child, who was still holding his hand and watching the conversation with growing anxiety. The boy might not understand the words, but he could read emotions well enough to know that something bad was being discussed. And what happens after your comprehensive study? Marcus asked. That will depend on the results, Commander Thex Vaughn said. If the species shows potential for peaceful integration, appropriate measures will be taken. If not, alternative solutions will be considered. The euphemistic language made Marcus's blood run cold. He had heard similar phrases used by military officers and corporate executives when they wanted to avoid talking about unpleasant realities. Alternative solutions could mean anything from permanent isolation to something much worse. You're talking about a child, Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled rage. A kid who's already lost everything and everyone he's ever known, and you want to turn him into a test subject. Emotional responses are understandable but irrelevant, Commander Thex Vaughn replied. The greater good requires. Marcus cut the communication with a sharp gesture, the screen going dark. The child looked up at him with worried eyes, clearly sensing the adult's distress. What are you planning to do? Dr. Ixthala asked quietly. Marcus was already moving toward the ship's control console, his hands flying over the navigation controls. I'm planning to be somewhere else when the commander decides to enforce his authority. You can't outrun a council diplomatic vessel, Dr. Ixthala pointed out. Their ships are faster and better armed than anything you have. I don't need to outrun them, Marcus said. I just need to disappear long enough to find somewhere safe for him. The child was watching Marcus work with fascination, clearly recognizing the purposeful activity of preparation for departure. He said something in his musical language that sounded excited, pointing at the navigation display. That's right, buddy, Marcus said. We're going on a trip. Dr. Ixthala found herself facing a decision that would define the rest of her career. She could stay aboard Marcus's ship and become an accessory to what the council would certainly consider kidnapping, or she could return to the mining station and report everything she had observed to Commander Thex Vaughn. She thought about the 3 days she had spent watching Marcus care for the child, seeing the trust and affection that had grown between them. She thought about the clinical language the commander had used when discussing the boy's future, the casual way he had referred to a sentient child as a specimen. The asteroid field extends for several light years, she said suddenly. There are thousands of hiding places among the larger rocks, and the mineral composition interferes with most scanning technologies. Marcus looked at her in surprise. Doc? Hypothetically speaking, Dr. Ixthala continued, a small ship could lose itself in that maze for weeks before being found, assuming the pilot knew how to navigate without relying on external beacons. Marcus smiled for the first time since the council ship had arrived. Hypothetically speaking, I've been flying through asteroid fields for 5 years. I know every rock worth hiding behind. The ship's engines hummed to life, and Marcus began the delicate process of undocking from the mining station without triggering any automated tracking systems. In a few minutes, they would be free in the vast emptiness of space with an entire galaxy of possibilities ahead of them. But first, they had to survive the next few hours. Commander Thex Vaughn was not the type to accept defiance quietly, and the Galactic Council had resources that extended far beyond a single diplomatic ship. The real chase was about to begin. The hunt lasted 6 weeks. Marcus had underestimated the Council's determination to retrieve what they considered a valuable research specimen. Commander Thex Vaughn had called in favors from across the galactic military, and soon Marcus found himself dodging patrol ships, automated probes, and bounty hunters who saw the reward for his capture as an easy payday. But Marcus had advantages that his pursuers lacked. His ship was small enough to hide in places that larger vessels couldn't reach, and his experience as a mechanic had taught him how to mask energy signatures and run silent when necessary. More importantly, he was fighting for something that mattered more than regulations or career advancement. The child, who had started calling himself something that sounded like Liam when Marcus pointed to himself and said Marcus, had adapted to life on the run with the resilience that seemed characteristic of his people. He learned to recognize the warning signs that meant they needed to hide, helped Marcus monitor the ship's systems, and even began picking up basic galactic common language through a combination of immersion and the translation programs that Dr. Ixthala had developed. Dr. Ixthala herself had proven invaluable as a fugitive. Her scientific credentials opened doors that would have remained closed to a lone human mechanic, and her growing understanding of human psychology helped her predict Marcus's decisions in ways that confused their pursuers. Contact bearing 27 Mark 14, she reported from the sensor station as they drifted silent behind a massive iron asteroid, Council patrol ship running a standard search pattern. Marcus watched the distant energy signature on his display, calculating vectors and timing. The patrol ship was being thorough but predictable, following the kind of methodical search pattern that worked well for finding lost cargo but wasn't designed to catch someone who was actively avoiding detection. Liam was curled up in the pilot's chair next to Marcus, sleeping peacefully despite the danger they were in. Over the past weeks, the boy had become Marcus's constant companion, following him around the ship and chattering in his musical language about everything he saw. The trust between them had deepened into something that transcended species and culture, the kind of bond that humans recognized instinctively even when they couldn't explain it scientifically. He's getting stronger, Dr. Ixthala observed, watching the child sleep. The nightmares are less frequent, and his stress responses have stabilized significantly. Marcus nodded, remembering the first few nights when Liam had woken up screaming from dreams about the destruction of his ship. The boy had needed constant reassurance then, afraid that Marcus would disappear like everyone else in his life had. Now he slept soundly, secure in the knowledge that the adult who had promised to protect him would still be there when he woke up. He's a tough kid, Marcus said quietly, tougher than he should have to be. The patrol ship completed its sweep and moved on to the next sector. Marcus waited another 20 minutes before powering up his engines and slipping away toward their next hiding spot, a nebula field 3 days away that would mask their presence for weeks if necessary, but they couldn't run forever. Marcus's ship was starting to show the strain of constant travel and hasty repairs, and their supplies were running low. More importantly, Liam needed stability and social contact beyond the small crew of fugitives who had become his surrogate family. I've been thinking, Dr. Ixthala said, as they settled into the long journey toward the nebula, about where we could take him. Marcus looked up from the maintenance schedule he'd been reviewing. I'm open to suggestions. There are human colonies, she said. Settled worlds that aren't part of the Council's direct jurisdiction. Independent systems that might be willing to take in a refugee. The Council would pressure them to turn him over, Marcus pointed out. And most of those worlds don't have the resources to resist that kind of political pressure. Dr. Ixthala pulled up a star chart on her console, highlighting several systems near the galactic rim. What about the frontier worlds? The settlements beyond Council space? Marcus studied the chart with interest. The frontier worlds were a loose confederation of colonies that had chosen to remain independent of galactic politics. They were rough, dangerous places where people went to escape their pasts and build new lives, but they were also fiercely protective of their autonomy. It could work, Marcus admitted. Some of those worlds have human populations, and they don't ask too many questions about where people come from. Liam stirred in his sleep, mumbling something in his musical language that sounded like a fragment of a lullaby. Marcus found himself wondering what the boy's parents had been like, what kind of songs they had sung to him during the long journey between stars. There's another option, Dr. Ixthala said carefully. We could try to complete his people's original mission. Marcus turned to look at her. What do you mean? I've been analyzing the data we recovered from his ship's wreckage, she explained. Navigation records, stellar cartography, mission parameters. I think I figured out where they were going. She brought up another star chart, this one showing a system near the edge of known space. Kepler 438b, a terrestrial world with a compatible atmosphere and established ecosystem. The generation ship was heading there to establish a new colony. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Are you saying there might be other ships? Other survivors? It's possible, Dr. Ixthala said. Generation ship missions typically involved multiple vessels launched at different times to the same destination. Liam's ship might have been part of a larger fleet. The possibility that the boy might not be alone in the universe after all was almost too much to hope for, but Marcus had learned to be cautious about hope, especially when it involved the life of a child who had already lost so much. It's a long shot, he said. Most of the best things in life are, Dr. Ixthala replied. Marcus looked down at Liam, who was still sleeping peacefully in the pilot's chair. The boy had trusted him completely, had placed his entire future in the hands of a human stranger who had nothing to offer except stubborn determination and a refusal to abandon someone who needed help. Maybe it was time to trust in return. Set course for Kepler 438, Marcus said. Let's see if we can find this kid a home. Behind them, the patrol ship had discovered their previous hiding spot and was calling for reinforcements. The hunt would continue, but Marcus no longer cared about the odds against them. He had something worth fighting for, and he was beginning to understand the true meaning of the human saying that had guided him through the darkest moments of his life. Family wasn't about blood or genetics or shared history. Family was about the promises you made and the lengths you were willing to go to keep them. And Marcus had made a promise to a child who had been crying alone in the darkness, waiting for someone to care enough to come back with tools and hope and an absolute refusal to give up. The stars ahead held answers, and Marcus intended to find them. The Kepler 438 system looked empty when they first dropped out of hyperspace. Marcus felt his heart sink as the sensors showed nothing but the pale yellow star and its collection of planets, with no signs of artificial structures or energy signatures that would indicate human presence. I'm sorry, Dr. Ixthala said quietly, watching the disappointed expression on Marcus's face. The calculations seemed sound, but perhaps the other ships were delayed, or took different routes. Liam, now fluent enough in galactic common to follow basic conversations, looked between the two adults with worried eyes. Home? He asked in his accented voice. People like me? Marcus knelt down to the boy's level, struggling to find words that would soften the blow. I don't know, buddy. Maybe they haven't arrived yet. But as they moved deeper into the system, Marcus's sensors began picking up something that made him reconsider his initial assessment. The fourth planet, a blue-green world that matched the descriptions from the generation ship's navigation data, was showing atmospheric anomalies. The gas composition was subtly different from what a natural world should have, with trace elements that suggested industrial activity. There, Dr. Ixthala said suddenly, pointing at her sensor display. Low orbit around the planet. Those aren't natural formations. Marcus enhanced the sensor image and felt his breath catch. Dozens of cylindrical structures were orbiting the planet in perfect formation, their hulls dark and inactive but clearly artificial. They looked like generation ships in sleep mode, their populations already deployed to the surface below. They made it, Marcus whispered. They actually made it. Liam pressed against the viewport, his eyes wide as he stared at the distant planet. Home, he said again, but this time with wonder instead of question. As they approached the planet, Marcus's communication system crackled to life. A voice speaking in the same musical language that Liam used filled the ship's bridge, asking questions that Marcus couldn't understand, but that clearly represented some kind of orbital traffic control. Liam bounced excitedly and began chattering back in rapid musical phrases. The voice on the radio paused, then began asking what sounded like urgent questions. Liam's responses became more animated, and Marcus could hear his own name being mentioned along with words that might have referred to ships in space and rescue. What's he telling them? Marcus asked Dr. Ixthala. I think he's explaining what happened to his ship, she replied, and how you saved him. The radio conversation continued for several minutes with multiple voices joining in from the planet's surface. Marcus could hear the excitement and emotion in their tones even without understanding the words. They were hearing from a child they had given up for dead, learning that their lost ship hadn't been forgotten. Finally, Liam turned to Marcus with tears streaming down his face. "They want to meet you," he said in Galactic Common. "They want to thank the human who brought me home." Marcus felt his own eyes growing wet. "Tell them it was an honor. The landing field they were directed to was a marvel of human engineering adapted to an alien world. The structures were built from local materials, but designed with the curved aesthetics that Marcus recognized from Earth architecture. Gardens filled with both terrestrial and native plants surrounded buildings that looked like they had been grown, rather than constructed. As Marcus's ship settled onto the landing pad, crowds of people began gathering around the perimeter. They looked human, but with the same subtle modifications that Liam carried. Slightly taller than baseline, with enhanced bone structure and skin that seemed better adapted to the planet's particular mix of solar radiation. Liam was practically vibrating with excitement as the ship's ramp lowered. The moment it touched the ground, he raced outside and into the arms of a woman who could only have been his mother. The reunion was everything that Marcus had hoped for, a joyful explosion of tears and laughter, and the kind of desperate embraces that only came after loss had been transformed into unexpected recovery. More people crowded around, all speaking in rapid musical phrases and reaching out to touch Liam as if to confirm that he was real. Marcus stood at the top of his ship's ramp, watching the scene unfold and feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal accomplishment. The boy was home. The promise had been kept. A group of older humans approached the ship, their faces solemn with the weight of leadership and loss. They spoke to Marcus in careful Galactic Common, their words formal but heavy with emotion. "We are the Council of New Eden," their leader said. "We represent the 47,000 souls who made the journey from Earth to build a new home among the stars. We owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Marcus shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone would do." "That is where you are wrong," the leader replied. "We have learned much about the galaxy during our journey. We know that most species would have left a single child to the bureaucrats and scientists. You risked everything to bring him home to us." Dr. Ixthala emerged from the ship behind Marcus, her scientific instruments recording everything for what would become the most important xenological study of her career. But she found herself less interested in the data than in the emotional dynamics playing out around her. "Your people," she said to the council leader. "You're survivors." "We are the children of survivors," he corrected. "Our ancestors left Earth because they knew that humanity needed more than one world to ensure its survival. They were proved right when the wars came, and the home world was left uninhabitable." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Earth is gone?" "Not gone," the leader said sadly, "but wounded perhaps beyond healing. The generation ships were humanity's insurance policy. Seeds scattered across the galaxy so that the species would survive even if the parent civilization failed." Marcus thought about the implications of that revelation. Liam's people weren't just colonists, they were refugees from a disaster that had consumed the birth world of their species. They carried with them not just their own hopes for the future, but the genetic and cultural heritage of all humanity. "How many ships made it here?" Marcus asked. 7 of the original 12, the leader replied. "We lost 5 to various disasters during the journey. Liam's ship was the last to depart Earth, carrying the final archives of human knowledge and culture. When we lost contact with them, we feared that those treasures were lost forever." Liam came running back to Marcus, his face glowing with happiness. "Marcus," he called out, "come meet my family. Come see our home." Marcus looked down at the boy, then at the thriving human settlement that surrounded them, and finally at Dr. Ixthala, who was watching him with knowing eyes. "What will you do now?" she asked. Marcus had been asking himself the same question. His ship was deteriorating, his supplies were nearly exhausted, and the Galactic Council was still hunting for him across half the galaxy. But looking at Liam's expectant face and the welcoming expressions of the colonists, the answer seemed obvious. "I think I'll stay for a while," he said. "Make sure the kid settles in okay. Maybe help with some mechanical work around the colony." Dr. Ixthala smiled. "And after that?" Marcus looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the alien sky, thinking about the 5-generation ships that had never made it to their destination. Somewhere out there, other human children might be crying alone in the darkness, waiting for someone to care enough to come back with tools and hope. "After that," Marcus said, "I think I'll go looking for the others." The human mechanic had found his purpose among the stars, and the galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided that no one would be left behind. Not even if it took forever. Not even if it meant fighting the entire universe to bring their children home.